With its incredible speed, versatility, durability, maneuverability, and approximately 5,600-kilometer range, the F-15 Eagle is arguably the most capable fighter jet of all time. When it arrived on the scene, the F-15 stood out as the first fighter that could attack multiple enemy targets simultaneously. From distances of up to 160 kilometers, it could pin down even fast-moving targets using its sophisticated nose-mounted radar system and advanced air-to-air radar-guided missiles. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what this fighter was capable of. Join us today as we talk about how the F-15 exceeded all expectations and earned its place as one of the greatest fighters ever made. The F-15A took flight in 1974, and by January 1976, the first Eagles destined for combat operations were being delivered to the US Air Force's 555th Fighter Squadron, part of the 31st Operations Group stationed at the Aviano Air Base in Italy. But the credit for the first F-15 combat kill would not go to a US pilot. That honor would actually go to an Israeli Air Force ace named Moshe Melnik, who in 1979 destroyed a Soviet-made MiG-21 that had unlawfully entered Israeli-controlled airspace over Lebanon. During that one engagement, Israeli pilots reportedly downed a total of 4 Syrian-flown MiG-21s. After that, and throughout the Lebanon War of 1982, the IAF would use its new F-15s to target Palestinian factions in Lebanon and down dozens of Syrian-flown MiGs. The IAF even used their F-15s as escorts during Operation Opera, a controversial surprise airstrike on an unfinished Iraqi nuclear reactor 17 kilometers southeast of Baghdad. With the immediate and unquestionable success of the F-15, it looked as though the US now possessed the most formidable fighter jet on the market, and this terrified the Soviets. Looking back a few decades, during the Korean War, the battle for air superiority was fought largely between the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15. Both aircraft were lightweight and maneuverable and could hold their own during intense air-to-air combat. By the mid-1950s, however, certain technological advancements began to reshape fighter aircraft design. The glory days of dogfighting gave way to cutting-edge radar systems and guided missiles capable of striking unseen targets kilometers away. Mesmerized by these new technologies, military strategists became convinced that aerial battles of the future would be fought mostly screen-to-screen from beyond visual range, with the enemy no more than a blip on the pilot's radar screen. And it was this forecasting that led to the production of the supersonic F-4 Phantom, also known as the Flying Brick, the Lead Sled, the Rhino, and Double Ugly. Of the Phantom's many celebrated qualities, beauty was not one of them. With its fat nose and upward-sloping wing and downward-sloping tail, it looked a bit like a model aircraft kit that had been assembled wrong. Compared to its more light and agile predecessors, however, the Phantom was a killer. Optimized for speed, but also carrying a heavy payload of missiles and sporting a powerful new radar system, the Phantom became a symbol of Western tactical air power throughout the Cold War era, spanning the 1960s and 70s. From 1958 to 1979, an impressive 5,195 were manufactured. This included 12 different variants that would ultimately serve in the air forces of more than a dozen nations across the globe. But the F-4 also had plenty of issues, including but not limited to poor rearward visibility, a wide turning radius, and a tendency to lose control during sharp maneuvers. But these shortcomings wouldn't be exposed until the Phantoms were properly combat tested during the Vietnam War. In the early 1960s, under the mistaken impression that traditional dogfighting had become obsolete, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara decided he could revolutionize military aviation with one idea: build a single fighter aircraft that could be used by the Air Force, Navy, and Marines. Having a shared platform, he argued, would not only save money, but would simplify operations and promote cooperation between branches. McNamara also insisted on giving the aircraft a common name. You guessed it, the F-4 Phantom. McNamara's untested approach, however, driven mostly by data and the desire for logistical efficiency, would prove to be disastrous. During the war, as the airspace above Vietnam swarmed with both friendly and enemy aircrafts, the F-4's target identification system, that was supposed to aid pilots, proved to be unreliable at best. Left with no other option, Phantom pilots were forced to approach hostile aircrafts so they could establish visual confirmation before engaging their target, most of which were MiGs and much better suited for close-range fighting, which put the F-4s at a huge disadvantage. Most of the F-4's air-to-air missile shots completely missed their targets, and not only did their engines leave a highly visible smoke trail for enemies to follow, but early models also lacked an onboard cannon for close-range firing. Instead of the over-the-horizon missile duels the F-4s were designed for, the air combat pilots were seeing in Vietnam looked much more like the low-speed, low-altitude, close-in battles of World War II. Optimal conditions for the smaller, more maneuverable MiG-17, 19, and 21s being used by the North Vietnamese. The Vietnam War in general did little to help the US's reputation in terms of air power, and when critics of the war brought up the overall ineffectiveness of Operation Rolling Thunder, the aggressive bombing campaign championed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, which resulted in the loss of nearly 1,000 aircraft, worth more than $900 million, the F-4 made a useful scapegoat. Yes, the old Phantom clearly had its flaws, but what can you expect? It was a high-altitude interceptor being used as a fighter, and not only that, it was also being thrown up against fighters specifically designed to be fighters. Air Force planners tried to even the playing field by outfitting the F-4 with pod-mounted Gatling guns, while pilots also slowly learned to exploit the Phantom's superior speed, relying more on climbing and diving as opposed to turning. But the flying brick still struggled to hold its own against the North Vietnamese MiGs. Given the political and technological limitations placed on the F-4 during that time, it's hard to say what aircraft would have performed better. What the Air Force, Navy, and Marines truly needed was a modern, air superiority-focused jet fighter built for these sort of close-range brawls. But before the money men in Washington were going to foot the bill for that, they wanted to know if American pilots had the right stuff to handle such a comprehensive aircraft. Did American pilots have not only the skills, but also the guts it would take to beat the MiGs at their own game and ultimately dominate the skies? Following the Korean War, pilot training focused almost solely on intercepting Soviet nuclear bombers. Large, sluggish targets that lacked maneuverability, American pilots simply weren't being trained for the sort of close-range, shoot-and-move style of air combat they were experiencing in Vietnam. But while the Air Force decided that better missiles and technology were the answer to the beating they were taking in Southeast Asia, the Navy came to a different conclusion. Founded in 1969 by Lieutenant Commander Dan Pedersen, the now famous US Navy Fighter Weapons School, also known as Top Gun, wasn't just another training center. It was an elite academy where hand-picked instructors used their real-world experiences to develop and share new tactics and doctrines. Before any lecture was presented to students who weren't fresh recruits but seasoned pilots themselves already serving in operational units, the curriculum would be intensely scrutinized by a panel of other instructors, affectionately known as the Murder Board. The training initially centered around the F-4 Phantom, but quickly expanded to accommodate F-8 Crusader crews, followed by the newer F-14 Combat and F-18 Hornet. The instructors would fly various small, lightweight aircraft to replicate the performance of enemy MiGs. Along with the implementation of new tactics and strengthening of capabilities, the training also included a thorough investigation of enemy doctrine and equipment. Originally located in California at Naval Air Station Miramar in San Diego, Top Gun was moved in 1996 to Naval Air Station Fallon in Nevada, where it was integrated into the newly created Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center, now known as the Naval Aviation Warfighting Development Center. This move was largely due to the expanding role of the F-18, which required more airspace as well as air-to-surface attack ranges for training, and the vast deserts of Nevada had just that. As the training evolved, students would be broken into three groups: strike fighter tactics instructors, adversaries, and air intercept controllers. But each course was developed to enhance the others and provide the most realistic training ever seen in US naval aviation. And when their time in the desert was done, while some stayed on and became instructors themselves, most Top Gun graduates would return to their units to share their newly acquired skills and knowledge with their fellow pilots in the hope of elevating the overall quality of naval air operations. After the film Top Gun, starring Tom Cruise, was released in 1986, the school's reputation exploded, and for the first time the general public got a glimpse of every Navy pilot's need for speed. Today, though, the school and its Hollywood counterpart exist somewhere at odds. In the school's bylaws, it states that anyone overtly referencing the movie, be it a direct quote or not, will be hit with a $5 fine to be paid on the spot. What started in an old trailer as a low-budget experimental program designed to level the aerial playing field during the Vietnam War became one of the Defense Department's first centers for excellence, and ultimately, Top Gun's reputation for consistently producing results would turn it into a model for other military units. However, it would still take some time for these innovative teachings to make a noticeable difference in combat operations in Vietnam. In fact, it wasn't until March 28, 1970, a little over a year after the school was stood up, that the first crew trained at Top Gun would get to score its first kill. Flying an F-4 Phantom, Lieutenant Jerome Beaulieu and Lieutenant Junior Grade Stephen Barkley swept up behind a North Vietnamese MiG-21 and knocked it out of the sky with an expertly fired missile. 2 years later, the Navy's 7th Fleet was clocking a 13-to-1 kill ratio, shooting down 26 planes and losing only 2 during Operation Linebacker, the US's aerial response to an incursion into the demilitarized zone by North Vietnamese armor and artillery. So, Top Gun worked, but this was only the beginning. Now, the US needed a modern fighter jet worthy of the ace pilots the program was producing, and perhaps more importantly, to keep pace with the Soviets, who'd been out in front since 1967 after they unveiled their formidable new supersonic interceptor, the MiG-25 Foxbat. After the Foxbat was introduced, Soviet pilot Mikhail M. Komarov would immediately set new records for both speed and altitude, 2,981.5 kilometers per hour and 29,977 meters respectively, and it became clear that the Soviet air forces would soon be taking control of the skies. The Phantoms were having enough trouble with the MiG-21s they'd been squaring off against in Vietnam, which meant there was absolutely no fighter in the US arsenal capable of reliably countering the Foxbat. It could fly at higher altitudes than any other jet aircraft out there and was believed to be capable of reaching speeds in excess of Mach 3, over 3,350 km per hour. Among other advanced capabilities, the MiG-25 was also outfitted with multiple air-to-air and long-range air-to-surface missile systems. Faced with the reality that they'd been shown up by the Soviets, the Air Force embarked on a mission to develop the most formidable fighter jet in history. But to get started, they had to scrap all their earlier concepts, for the next generation fighters they'd been imagining were simply too large, too heavy, and would likely be less of a threat to Soviet MiGs than the Phantom had been. Now back at the drawing table in 1968, the Air Force invited the country's top aircraft builders to submit proposals for the new jet, and each entry was assessed using a new, groundbreaking concept called energy maneuverability, a mathematical formula based on thrust, weight, aerodynamic drag, wing area, and other flight characteristics to help define a fighter's overall performance. In the end, the contract for the new fighter was awarded to McDonnell Douglas, which was later acquired by Boeing, whose revolutionary design was the product of some 2.5 million man-hours. Development began almost immediately, and with its combination of speed, power, and agility, the F-15 Eagle would go on to exceed all expectations, earning its place as one of the greatest fighters ever built. The first prototype was unveiled in June 1972, just 3 years after McDonnell Douglas was awarded the contract, and both engineers and aviators were amazed. This twin-engine, all-weather tactical fighter could do things none other before it could do. For one, it could go from the ground level to nearly 20,000 meters in just 122 seconds. It was also the first US fighter jet that could accelerate vertically, flying straight up directly after takeoff with enough force to break the sound barrier. Which got a few people asking, is this an airplane or a rocket? In keeping with the traditions of the US, the philosophy underlying the production of the F-15 seemed to be all about speed. Initially equipped with 2 Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines, each capable of producing 25,000 pounds of thrust, today's F-15 variants come with 2 incredibly powerful General Electric F-110 GE119 afterburning turbofans, each putting out over 29,000 pounds of thrust. This amounts to a remarkably swift aircraft. Let's put it this way, it's faster than the F-4, it's faster than the F-14 Tomcat, F-16, F-18, and F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. It's even faster than its intended successor, the F-22 Raptor. With a top operational speed of Mach 2.5, the F-15 can really move. To achieve peak performance, the engines were equipped with variable air intakes controlled by a computerized system, which could be adjusted to ensure optimal airflow regardless of speed or angle of attack. Unlike earlier fighters such as the F-4, which featured smaller wings to accommodate high supersonic speeds, the F-15 had its weight spread over a relatively large wing area. Combined with a high thrust-to-weight ratio, this design choice resulted in exceptional maneuverability. To maximize visibility, the cockpit was positioned high in the fuselage, providing pilots with an expansive 360-degree view of the battlefield, while a digital heads-up display gave them better targeting and navigational ability. In combat training scenarios, the F-4s didn't stand a chance against the F-15s. Even the smaller, lighter F-5s, which were often used to simulate the more agile MiGs, struggled to shake the larger F-15. In nearly every engagement, whether beyond visual range or close-in dogfighting, the F-15 came out on top. Not only that, the F-15 is also incredibly durable. As the story goes, in 1983, during a routine training exercise, an Israeli F-15D collided mid-air with an A-force Skyhawk, and as a result, the right wing of the F-15 was sheared off about 60 centimeters from the fuselage. With their vision obstructed by vaporizing fuel, though, the crew of the F-15 were unaware of the full extent of the damage. The crew on the ground urged the pilot, Zivi Nadivi, to eject, but Nadivi declined, opting instead to try and regain control of the aircraft by engaging the afterburner. Gradually, he stabilized the fighter and aimed it for the nearest airfield, about 16 kilometers away. With only one wing remaining, due to the lift generated by the large areas of the fuselage, stabilators, and remaining wing, plus the sheer power of its engines, the F-15 was able to stay in the air. Reaching the airfield, Nadivi was forced to execute an impossible landing. Touching down at 480 km per hour, double the usual speed, the jet's arrestor tailhook was completely torn off. But Nadivi was still able to bring the crippled Eagle to a halt just 6 meters from the end of the runway. The pilot got out, shook his instructor's hand, and only then did he notice that the entire right wing of the aircraft was missing. No other airplane has ever come close to equaling this feat. At least 1,200 F-15A, B, C, D, J, and DJ variants have been built, while at least another 60 F-15K Slam Eagles were manufactured by Boeing for the Korean Air Force. And 50 years later, they are still being built, primarily with the F-15EX variant, a thoroughly modernized version of the F-15C and F-15E Strike Eagle, featuring modernized avionics among other enhanced capabilities. The F-15 can operate in all weather conditions while offering exceptional maneuverability, speed, and can carry a huge payload of missiles and ground bombs, as well as additional fuel. It's got state-of-the-art avionics and radar systems, and perhaps most importantly, a 6-barrel air-cooled, electrically fired 20mm M61 Gatling-style rotary cannon that can cook off 6,000 rounds per minute. So now that the Air Force had its very own air superiority fighter, of course the next thing they wanted to do was send a clear message to the Soviets. Just a year and a half earlier, the Soviets had set a new time-to-climb world record with the MiG-25, but that was before the F-15. Calling it the Strike Eagle program, in 1975, Air Force engineers carefully stripped a pre-production F-15 of all its non-critical components to minimize its weight. They even took off the paint. Taking advantage of the cold, dense air of North Dakota, the Eagle executed a series of climbs from a dead stop, ascending to altitudes as high as 30,000 meters, right up to the edge of the stratosphere. And when the judges on the ground checked their instruments, they found that the F-15 not only surpassed the time-to-climb records set by the MiG-25, it shattered them. Soon the first F-15s were headed out to the fleet, many arriving at West German air bases right on the Soviet Union's doorstep. So it looked like it would only be a matter of time before they faced off against the intimidating MiG-25. By chance though, just a short time later, much of the mystery surrounding the MiG-25 would be stripped away. For years, Air Force engineers wanted to get a closer look at the Soviet Union's new superfighter, and soon they would get their chance. But this opportunity didn't arrive as they'd expected. In September 1976, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, a 29-year-old pilot with the Soviet Air Defense Forces, decided to defect from the Soviet Union by flying his MiG-25 from a Soviet airbase to a civilian airport in Japan. This was like a gift from heaven for US military strategists and engineers who would soon be able to examine the Foxbat as closely as they liked and determine how the F-15 truly measured up. Given their superior performance in Vietnam, the MiG-21 had caused US aviators and planners a lot of stress, which only supercharged the hype surrounding the MiG-25. But upon closer inspection, the Foxbat wasn't the marvel of combat aviation everyone once thought. Despite their similar size and appearance, the MiG-25 and the F-15 were also very different aircrafts. Constructed primarily from heavy nickel-steel alloy, not the experimental lightweight metal some analysts had assumed, the Foxbat weighed nearly twice as much as the F-15. Originally, US engineers thought its large wings were designed for agility, but these turned out to be necessary simply to achieve enough lift to get it off the ground. The MiG-25 was so heavy, in fact, that it could only execute maneuvers at a max of 4.5 Gs, hardly better than the F-15. They discovered, too, that most of the Foxbat's oversized payload consisted of fuel to power its enormous engines. The engineers inspecting the MiG-25 were also surprised to find outdated vacuum tubes in its avionics and a radar system that lacked look-down capability, meaning it wouldn't be able to detect an enemy aircraft flying below the horizon. In the end, the MiG-25 wasn't the dogfighting monster that US military strategists feared it was. It was still a very capable high-altitude interceptor designed to achieve extraordinary speeds, capable of quickly intercepting and harassing enemy bombers, but its capabilities didn't reach far beyond this limited role. It was clear now, too, why the Soviets had chosen to shroud the Foxbat's true potential in secrecy and propaganda. Its bark seemed to be far worse than its potential bite. And this exposure really shook up the Soviets, because if the MiG-25 wasn't a match for the F-15, that meant the Soviet Union would no longer have the upper hand in a dogfight, and everyone knew it. But in January 1991, just as the Persian Gulf War was kicking off, these two iconic fighters would finally get the chance to go head-to-head over the skies of Baghdad. But this battle that the world had been anticipating since the Cold War would not turn out as expected. In the days leading up to the aerial showdown between the F-15 and MiG-25, the Iraqi leadership had come to the realization that they simply couldn't win a traditional air battle with the US-led coalition. So Saddam Hussein ordered the majority of the country's air assets to be stashed away in a series of bunkers. It was anyone's guess how long this war would go on, and the dictator thought he might need them to make a stand against the coalition later on. But this plan backfired big time, as the Air Force simply targeted the hangars and shelters where Saddam's precious planes were being stored. Overall, 117 Iraqi aircraft were destroyed without them ever leaving the ground. Though it was originally conceived of as an air superiority fighter, a fighter-bomber version of the F-15, known as the Strike Eagle, would later be developed. While leveraging the fighter's superior range, speed, and payload, this variant also had a weapons officer seated behind the pilot to ensure delivery of a number of guided missiles and bombs, making it a formidable ground attack aircraft. The Strike Eagle was responsible for much of the nighttime precision bombing of Iraqi assets during the war. Saddam's next attempt to save his remaining planes was to send them to Iran for safekeeping. This included military transport planes, fighters, and the only surviving radar early warning plane, known as the Adnan II. Iran, however, was both surprised and skeptical, at first running off the approaching planes with their own fighters. But eventually, they let in 90 or so aircraft, which they quickly seized. They even scored some points with President Bush by assuring Washington that all of Iraq's planes would remain impounded until the end of the war. In order for the Iraqi planes to get to Iran, however, they first had to pass through Baghdad airspace, which was by this time heavily fortified with air defenses. The US Air Force had established a formidable wall of F-15s along the Iranian border. Their job was to intercept and neutralize any Iraqi aircraft attempting to flee. So the only way through, as Saddam saw it, was to punch a hole by knocking out a few of the patrolling F-15s. Later, the Iraqi government claimed that 2 F-15s had been shot down during the battle, but the Air Force has insisted there's no record of an F-15 being shot down on January 30th anywhere around Baghdad. Nonetheless, this is probably the closest an F-15 has ever come to being shot down in air-to-air combat. What would become known as the Samura Air Battle, or Operation Samura to the Iraqi Air Force, occurred on January 30th, when the IQAF deployed a pair of MiG-25 interceptors to confront a pair of F-15s. Because the MiGs lacked maneuverability, they would need to make up for it with their raw speed. These were, after all, the fastest fighters of all time. Using this to their advantage, the Iraqi pilots would rush up on the unsuspecting F-15s. The plan was simple: an ambush, or rather a meticulously planned surprise attack intended to catch the only 2 F-15s flying that day off guard. In an instant, the 4 planes met in the sky over Baghdad, and a high-stakes aerial dogfight ensued, with both sides maneuvering aggressively as they unleashed a flurry of missiles. The advantage shifted back and forth as missiles were dodged or redirected using chaff and flares. After several minutes of intense fighting, during which the MiGs scored at least 1 hit, the Iraqi jets abruptly disengaged, turning on full afterburners as they headed back to Tammuz Air Base, as the F-15s returned to their base in Saudi Arabia. The Iraqi Air Force initially called the battle a possible victory, but later upgraded that to confirmed when a Bedouin smuggler apparently discovered the wreckage of an F-15 on the border of Saudi Arabia, close to where Iraqi radar had allegedly lost track of a falling F-15. With over 100 confirmed victories and 0 losses, the F-15 has remained the most successful modern fighter the world has ever seen. The Samura air battle marked the final offensive operation of the Iraqi Air Force during the Gulf War. By mid-February, all IQAF activity had ceased, allowing the coalition to reign supreme over the skies. In the end, most of the MiG-25s in Iraq's arsenals survived the war and were kept in service until the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when Saddam chose to bury them in the desert. An odd decision, but Saddam knew what American technology could do to his aging MiGs, especially now the US was flying the F-22, a single-seat twin-engine stealth fighter developed by Lockheed Martin. For their part, the two F-15 pilots involved in the Samura air battle, Captain Thomas Dietz and First Lieutenant Robert Heermann of the 53rd Tactical Fighter Squadron, would end up being the two highest-scoring fighter pilots of the Gulf War, each claiming 3 air-to-air kills. Nearly half a century after taking to the skies, the F-15 remains a testament to the ingenuity, resilience, and technological prowess of the US Air Force. From its inception as a dedicated air superiority fighter to its continued evolution and adaptation in modern warfare, the F-15 has consistently demonstrated unmatched performance and effectiveness on the battlefield. But before we wrap up this video, there's one more achievement of the F-15 that needs to be mentioned. At some point, the US decided that destroying Soviet satellites needed to be part of its defense plan, but it believed that the Russians would be able to detect a ground-to-orbit missile launch. So the US developed a special anti-satellite missile designed to be fired from an airborne F-15, also known as the ASM-135 missile, a standoff anti-satellite (ASAT) weapon that utilizes the F-15 as its initial stage. After undergoing modifications to accommodate the ASM-135 on its center line, from January 1984 to September 1986, 2 F-15As were repurposed as launch platforms. The ASAT program executed a total of 5 test launches before its official termination in 1988. They also reportedly tested the system successfully once in 1985, and as a result, Air Force Major Wilbert D. Doug Pearson became the only pilot in history with an air-to-orbit kill. Throughout its history, the F-15 has played a pivotal role in shaping air combat doctrine and maintaining air supremacy for the US and its allies, and its exceptional speed, agility, and lethality have made it a formidable adversary, capable of outperforming and outmaneuvering enemies in some of the most challenging of environments. Arguably, it's still one of the most versatile and intimidating platforms out there. But what do you think? Has the F-15 lived up to the hype that surrounds it? What happened in the Samura air battle? Is the F-15 truly a better fighter than the MiG-25? Who's got the more dominant air force now, the US or Russia? Let us know in the comments. Now go and check out how a US military spy plane drove the USSR crazy, or click this other video instead. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.